Wiliam Peyton Hubbard was the son of American slaves who settled in Toronto in the 1840s. In 1894, he became a member of City Council. He would be elected in 14 consecutive elections, becoming known as the Cicero of Council. Cicero was a famous Roman orator. In 1907, the Globe wrote, "His influence, when he cares to exert it, can accomplish more perhaps than any other member of City Council." This week's episode of Muddy York is about the first black man to be elected to public office in Toronto. Hi there, I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York.
In 1840, Moseley and Lavinia Hubbard left Virginia to settle in Toronto. Hubbard family history says that they were freed slaves who had been given permission to leave and that they arrived with $800 that Moseley had earned working in a Richmond hotel. At that time, black people made up about 2 to 3% of Toronto's population. Most of them were limited to manual labor or service jobs. They faced plenty of discrimination, and segregation was usually the norm. However, they generally didn't face overt hostility. Unlike other groups, like the Irish, Jews, or Italians, the black population was small enough that it wasn't seen as a threat to the existing social order. A professor at York said that blacks, quote, "were seen as people who belonged here, but not to be gotten too close to."
William Peyton Hubbard was born in 1842 in a cabin near Bloor and Bathurst. This area was called the Bush because it was a rural area on the far outskirts of the city. If you go there today, you know that not much has changed and the neighborhood is practically deserted. William was the second of 9 children in the Hubbard family. He was raised in a strict Anglican family and attended St. George's Church on John Street throughout his entire life. At some point, his father became the caretaker for the Phoebe Street School, which allowed William and his family to live there while he attended primary school. There were no public schools at that time, so the Hubbard family had to pay to send William to the elite model school. William worked afternoons and weekends, and his father spent months away from his family working as a steward at a luxury hotel in Niagara Falls in order to afford tuition. During his time at the model school, William fell in love with a fellow student named Julia Luckett. The problem was that she was offered a teaching position in Washington, D.C. William promised that he would come for her when he was financially secure. In 1874, at the age of 34, William married his high school sweetheart and they moved into a home on Bathurst Street. They would have 4 children together, and one of his great-great-grandchildren would write a biography that is one of the main sources for this episode.
Details about his career before he entered politics are a little thin. Upon graduation, Hubbard became a baker specializing in cakes. During the 1890s, he would patent the Hubbard portable oven. We don't know what made it unique, but different versions of the Hubbard oven would continue to be sold for decades to follow. In the same year that he got married, Hubbard would become a horse-drawn cab driver with his uncle's livery business. It's not clear if this was in addition to or in place of his work as a baker. By 1878, he would have his own livery stables at 59 Bathurst Street. It was in his role as a cab driver that Hubbard would meet George Brown. Brown was one of the most important public figures in Canada. He created the Globe newspaper, and he was one of the leading fathers of Confederation. There are 2 different stories about how Hubbard met him. The most common version is that he rescued Brown after an accident left his cab perched precariously close to the Don River. However, in a 1934 interview, Hubbard said that he offered his services to Brown as a sober alternative after hearing him complain about drunken cab drivers. Hubbard became one of Brown's regular drivers, and Brown would tutor him about politics and government.
In 1893, Hubbard decided to run for alderman, which is what city councilors were called in those days. At the time, Toronto was divided into 6 wards, all running from the lake to the city boundary north of Bloor, and each ward would elect 4 aldermen. Hubbard ran in Ward 4, which ran from Bathurst to University. Toronto's black community mostly lived in Ward 3, so the people voting for Hubbard were overwhelmingly white. Press accounts of his campaign were generally positive. The Toronto Daily News said, "He's a gentleman of sound business ability, and the peoples whose suffrages he is asking for know this. Mr. Hubbard exactly fits the bill in possessing the requirements of a good alderman." In this campaign, he would come 5th, just 6 votes shy of the 4th and final spot on council. But at this time, municipal elections were held annually, and in 1894, Hubbard would come 2nd, winning election to city council with 1,996 votes. He would continue to be elected for the next 13 consecutive elections. Hubbard first made a name for himself by opposing a proposal from the Georgian-based ship Cannell and Power Aqueduct Company to supply the city's water. The plan involved a scheme to build an aqueduct along Yonge Street to bring water from Lake Simcoe. Beside the practical questions associated with this proposal, the city had controlled its water supply for the past 25 years, and Hubbard staunchly supported public control of utilities. At the final debate, council supported a resolution from Hubbard that expressed its severe condemnation of any scheme, having for its object the transference of the waterworks or the letting of any contract for the supply of water for the use of citizens of Toronto to any private individual, firm, company, or corporation. This debate would make Hubbard an important figure in Toronto politics.
Hubbard's political style was very direct. Depending on your opinion, he might be described as honest and forthright or scathing and self-righteous. He was prone to grandstanding, but he also did his homework, and his speeches included plenty of evidence in support of his argument. In terms of his politics, Hubbard could be described as a good government reformer and a bootstraps conservative. Like many self-made men, he felt that others should be able to copy his success. He believed that government should be more efficient, and he would champion a proposal to slash the wages of city employees as part of a plan to control municipal spending. He emphasized family, church, and a strong work ethic. He was also staunchly supportive of the monarchy and the British Empire of which Canada was a part. That's not to say that he didn't have a social conscience. Generally speaking, he would champion individuals that he felt had been treated unfairly. In one case, he defended the Chinese community against exorbitant license fees meant to drive Chinese-operated laundries out of business. However, he was utterly contemptuous of anyone that he regarded as lazy or negligent. He demanded that municipal workers be fired when others called for a second chance. He was outraged that a fellow alderman had supplied alcohol to firemen on duty during the X. Again, depending on your point of view, this made him honest and brave or judgmental and unforgiving.
This is as good as a place as any to discuss the role that race played in his career. Hubbard never presented himself as a representative of the Toronto black community and rarely spoke about race. In one letter to a friend, he wrote, "I have always felt that I am a representative of race hitherto despised, but if given fair opportunity, would be able to command esteem." The press was generally favorable towards him, not least because his outspoken nature made for good copy. However, papers that opposed him were known to use exaggerated racial features in their cartoons. Hubbard's profile and influence meant that he largely avoided discrimination in Toronto. However, he would often face it outside the city. A racial slur was directed at him during a debate of the Union of Canadian Municipalities, and he needed a reference letter from the mayor confirming his identity as an alderman to make a work trip to Washington, D.C. In 1898, Hubbard would be one of 4 aldermen elected to the Board of Control. The Board of Control doesn't exist anymore, but it used to act as a kind of municipal cabinet responsible for monitoring all government spending. As a member of the Board of Control, Hubbard would often serve as acting mayor if the regular mayor was out of town. Controllers, as they were known, were initially chosen by council, which led to all sorts of backroom deals about who got elected. However, Hubbard was part of a group who supported the direct election of controllers, arguing that voters should be able to choose whichever candidate they thought would control government spending. This change was eventually approved, and starting in 1904, controllers would be elected at large. The entire city would cast votes for the same group of candidates, and the top 4 vote-getters would become members of the Board of Control.
Hubbard would be elected to the Board of Control from 1904 to 1907. This made him one of the most powerful men in the city. Over the next 4 years, he would pass 100 different bills. In 1905, he became president of the Ontario Municipal Association. In 1906, he came first in the controller elections, with only 1,500 votes fewer than the mayor received. However, in 1907, he dropped to fourth, and his vote total fell by more than 40%. The following year, he dropped to fifth, and lost election for the first time in 15 years. The obvious question is, what caused such a sharp fall in support? And the answer is public electricity. At this time, municipal power was supplied entirely by private companies, and in 1903, the Toronto Electric Light Company had been granted a license to supply power all the way from Niagara Falls. However, there was a growing movement for people's power, meaning public control of the electrical grid. And in 1905, a new provincial government created the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario, which would become Ontario Hydro. As we mentioned during the debate about the waterworks, Hubbard strongly believed in public ownership of utilities. He was appointed to represent Toronto on the Hydro Commission and supported a plebiscite on a bylaw approving a new citywide public power grid. He spent a good part of 1906 speaking across the city and meeting with voters, and when the plebiscite was held at the beginning of 1907, the new bylaw was approved with more than 75% of the vote. However, despite the success of this campaign, the drive for people's power significantly hurt Hubbard's support at the polls. Although controllers were elected by voters from across the city, Hubbard's greatest support had always come from his old constituents in the 4th Ward. The problem was these constituents were generally upper and middle-class voters who opposed public ownership. Hubbard had been a leader of this campaign, and he paid the political price for it.
Many people expressed regret for his defeat. The Telegram wrote that the civic government of Toronto is far from perfect, but it is cleaner and more progressive than that of almost any other city of its importance in America. For much of Toronto's immunity from scandal, we have to thank public-spirited citizens like Alderman Hubbard.
Toronto, unfortunately, seems to have lost that immunity from scandal.
So it would seem. Hubbard would run for controller again in 1909 and 1910, but come in 6th both times. During this period, he would move into a large house built at 660 Broadview. His son Fred lived next door, and the whole family would share weekly Sunday dinners. Incidentally, Fred Hubbard would become chairman of the TTC in 1929, continuing the family's connection to municipal government. In 1913, Hubbard was convinced to run once again, but this time as an alderman for the 1st Ward where his new house was located. He was elected, but things had changed. Instead of a powerful controller, he was just an ordinary alderman. Plus, he was now 71, and his wife was increasingly sick from diabetes, so he no longer had the same energy to fight the battles of municipal politics. So, he decided to retire for good. His retirement party was a lavish affair attended by the current and former mayor. He was praised for his role in the development of Hydro, and the residents of the 1st Ward unveiled a portrait of him that would be hung in City Hall. You can see the portrait on the Mighty York Twitter feed or Facebook page. Hubbard's retirement wasn't the end of the story. His wife Julia would die in 1917. However, he would live until 1935 when he was 93 years old, which was ancient for those days. For a brief period before his death, he was literally the oldest man in Toronto. During these years, he came to be seen as the grand old man of Toronto politics. His birthday parties became popular events, and he always insisted on baking his own birthday cake. When asked about the secret to his longevity, he said, "Keep yourself occupied. Even if you have enough money to get along without work, keep yourself occupied just the same. Too much leisure makes a man languid." Tributes poured in upon his death. The Mail and Empire wrote, "The late William P. Hubbard was one of Toronto's most respected citizens. He had a strong sense of public duty, and his labors in city council were both conscientious and fruitful. The Globe called him an estimable citizen, gifted with an enviable clarity of expression, and his views on civic affairs were marked by sound common sense. He was buried at the Toronto necropolis in Cabbagetown. He is in an unmarked grave, but the rest of his family is buried about 100 meters from him under a marker on which his name appears. We'd like to thank Gilles Huot for the Cabbagetown Preservation Association for that detail." Hubbard's profile would fade in the decades after his death. However, interest in his story revived during the 70s as Toronto's Black community continued to grow. During this time, an author and historian named Daniel Hill did much to revive knowledge about Hubbard's life and career. In 1979, Hubbard's portrait was hung in a committee room in the new City Hall building. In the same week, a historical plaque was added to his house on Broadview. Today, it houses classrooms for the Montcrest School and has been renamed as Hubbard House. The City of Toronto's William Peyton Hubbard Award for Race Relations was established in 1989, and Hubbard Park was opened at Broadview and Gerrard in 2016. Hubbard would also appear as a character in 2 episodes of Murdoch Mysteries.
And in modern Toronto, you really don't get a higher testament than an appearance in Murdoch Mysteries. We'd like to thank everyone for tuning in for this episode, and we really hope you'll be back in 2 weeks to listen to the next episode, because we will be hosting our very first guest host, who will be speaking on their own subject. Well, for once, Gray and I get to listen and learn alongside you guys. Now, who will this guest host be, and what will they be talking about? Well, you'd better be back in 2 weeks to find out. So, until then, I'm Adam Weiser.
I'm Grayson Miller, and this is Muddy York.